Good morning to our viewers here in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. It has been said that when women do better, countries do better. However, globally, gender equity is lagging. Today, on International Women's Day, we will explore how a greater focus on gender equality can reshape how foreign policy and national security are conducted. I'm joined by Dr. Hannah Neumann, a member of the European Parliament, where she serves as the Peace and Human Rights Coordinator for the Greens. She is also Vice Chair of the Human Rights Committee and a member of both the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Committee on Security and Defense Policy. Herzlich willkommen.
Dankeschön.
I'm also joined by Julia Santucci, Senior Lecturer in Intelligence Studies and Director of the Johnson Institute for Responsible Leadership and the Frances Hesselbein Leadership Forum at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Julia also served as Senior Advisor in the Secretary of State's Office of Global Women's Issues during the Obama administration. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hopefully, in just a few minutes, we will also be joined by Dr. Armgard von Reden. She's the Chairwoman of Women in International Security Germany, and also a strategy consultant based in Berlin who advises companies on diversity and data protection issues. A more detailed bio of each of our speakers has been posted to the chat for those of you who want to read up on who is joining us today. What we're talking about today is nothing new. As a matter of fact, in 2000, the United Nations adopted a resolution on women, peace, and security. It reaffirmed the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, in peace negotiations, in peace building and peacekeeping, in humanitarian response, and in post-conflict reconstruction. The resolution also underscored the importance of their equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the maintenance and promotion of peace and security. At the time, it was considered to be groundbreaking, but that was 20 years ago. Since then, several countries, including Sweden, Canada, France, and Mexico, have adopted their own, quote, feminist foreign policy practices. So let's start with a lightning round. In one sentence each, what is feminist foreign policy? Hannah, do you want to take a crack at that? And then Julia?
Yeah, and it's not going to be a typical German sentence with long semicolon lists. It's just a feminist foreign policy is a foreign policy for everybody. It's that simple.
And Julia?
I drafted the typical German sentence with semicolons. And now Hannah's shown me up with such a simplistic and straightforward answer. I mean, I certainly agree with her. I mean, just to make it a little bit more specific, I think it's prioritizing gender equality as a key consideration in the way that a country engages with the world. Integrating gender analysis into all policy debates and plans, and implementing both policies and programs with enough funding that advance gender equality, human rights, equity, and inclusion globally.
Well, Julia, I think those are all important points and undoubtedly ones that we'll get into during the course of our conversation. But it actually does segue nicely to a deeper question for Hannah, because late last year, the European Union adopted a Gender Equality Strategy 2025, which was not quite as simple or succinct as Hannah's one-liner on feminist foreign policy, but it is a plan whereby the EU can actually address the structural causes of gender inequality by taking a transformative approach and by helping to empower women and girls as drivers of change. Hannah was actually one of the architects of the gender equality strategy. And so I'd like to ask you, Hannah, to share with us some of the key points of the plan in broad brushstrokes.
Thanks, Stephen. And I actually have to kind of deconstruct your question now, because it already shows that we have a problem with too many strategies. There is the gender equality strategy of the Commission, which is more like a domestic, let's say, focus. Domestic still meaning all European countries, but it's kind of like a domestic policy. And then there's the gender action plan, which is for the whole external action of the European Union. And when it comes to the gender action plan, that is where I can be credited for having some impact. On the domestic gender equality strategy, it's just me being a feminist, but no specific input beyond that. So when it comes to the gender action plan, it kind of builds on the work that we did in the Parliament, which was to have a report on gender equality in EU's foreign and security policy. And we made sure that this report would be in the right timing to inform the gender action plan of the Commission. And it's not just the gender action plan, it's the gender action plan 3. So you see, we have really this proliferation of studies and papers and action plans. What is good about this gender action plan, nevertheless, why I think it very much merits the attention you give to it, is it comes up with very specific goals now. So for example, it talks about 50% women on all management levels in the European External Action Service, but also when it comes to our CSDP missions, so kind of the EU peace missions. It says that whenever we do spending of our foreign money, 85% of the spending needs to go into projects that have gender equality as one of their main objectives. And here, I mean, you can be assured that there is an increasing big mafia that makes sure it's not pink washing. So we're not just ticking the box, but it really is an objective, not just that women get funds, but that the money is used to decrease the discrimination that is in place. It also looks, and it does two things which I think are very important that we try to do in our report as well. First of all, it tries to look at the different policies that we as the European Union have. So it looks at trade. So for example, one thing is in trade deals, we need a chapter that looks into the sometimes even unintended effects these trade deals may have on gender. So for example, if we have trade deals that put big agriculture companies in the forefront, this is actually detrimental for women because most of them work in these small, very small farming areas. And sometimes you don't even realize it if you don't have the gender lens. So the gender lens needs to be in all trade agreements. We need to look at the whole issue of migration and asylum through a gender lens, because as long as we don't have legal pathways, it's the young boys that get in, and then the women depend on them to be taken also with the family reunification, which kind of increases the whole paternalistic and patriarchal system that we actually want to fight. It looks at digitalization. And it looks at climate. And I think especially the last issue of climate policy is very important because 80% of climate-related displacement threatens women or targets women. Women are the worst affected, again, the same that we had with crisis and conflict. And again, women do not sit at the negotiation tables. Again, women do not get the funding. So this one, I think it's really frustrating that we are basically in the same discussion that we had 20 years ago on war and peace. The other thing it does is it looks at the EU's own institutions. And that is the big thing I'm always saying. It's one thing to say the Egyptians and the Saudis should be nicer with their women. Well, we have limited influence on that. It's the other thing that are our delegations that travel to Saudi to send this message purely male, which often they are, which I really think, kind of puts the whole message into question. So looking at our own institutions and how we walk the talk. And finally, we are talking about mission matters, including this issue, gender equality and diversity. We are talking about staff assessments, where this is a core pillar. We are talking about trainings for everyone to just check kind of the privileges you have and how you can use them to decrease discrimination. So I think this plan, sometimes it's missing deadlines, sometimes it's missing the resources dedicated to it. That's something we as the Parliament will comment on. But if we really walk this talk, we are going to move ahead a lot in the next 5 years.
So Hannah, let me actually ask a question and push you on that a little bit, because one of the things that I think all of us have noticed is that during this time of the pandemic, pre-existing inequalities have been exacerbated and have been made much more tangible to a lot of people. To what degree did the fact that this action plan was put together during a pandemic contribute to some of the goals that you tried to set and some of the actionable items that you outlined?
Well, what we have seen in the pandemic, very much in the beginning, and I think we're still trying to fight against this, is this old notion of let's solve the problem first and then we look after the women. Rather than saying, if women don't sit at the table in the first place, that's maybe the biggest part of the problem. And now we are kind of running behind that. And when it comes to the gender action plan, I think there is the assessment that women are, again, by this pandemic, being more the victims than the men, and that the discrimination is being widened, and that we're falling back into all these patterns, which I think rhetorically helped to set this very strong message that we need to counter this rollback. And that's maybe what has changed from 20 years onwards. So the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and Resolution 1325, that was an amazing step by then. And I think all of us who are doing this work today, we are standing on the shoulders of these female giants that fought for it. And now it's kind of normal that everybody says gender equality is important. And now basically everybody reiterates women are hit worse by the pandemic. But I'm still missing the concrete action to stop that. And I think maybe that will be our fight of our generation now, to really walk the talk. Because if we would fully implement Resolution 1325, it would even be groundbreaking today.
So I would definitely like to come back to what some of that concrete action can look like in our conversation. But let me bring Julia into the discussion as well, because as we were talking about before we went live, today there has been an important step, or will be an important step here in the US. It was announced that Joe Biden would sign an executive order to create a gender policy council, which hopefully will, as you said, Hannah, bring more women to the table, right? That's part of the idea behind that. But Julia, I'd like to ask you maybe to talk a little bit about this new council that will be created today, but more broadly, as somebody who worked in the Obama administration on gender equity issues and is very close to some people who are in the Biden administration, to what degree do you think that this administration will try to really promote gender equality, both internally, but also internationally?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Steve. And thanks for having me as part of this discussion. I'm really happy to be here. I think absolutely. So President Biden, he's been a champion for women and girls in the United States and globally throughout his career. From authoring the Violence Against Women Act in the United States, which was really groundbreaking at the time, to serving as a champion globally throughout his vice presidency. So I think there's certainly commitment to do this work on the part of the president and also on the part of Secretary of State Blinken. As you mentioned, today, the president will be signing an executive order creating a gender policy council. This is the successor to the White House Council on Women and Girls that existed during the Obama administration, with some key distinctions. First, it will be looking at gender equality and issues of equity in the United States and globally. So not only focused on women and girls, but also on issues around gender. And the other distinction is that it will be led by two individuals who report directly to the president. And so including one that her full-time job will be to lead the council. So I think that's really elevating it in status bureaucratically, which sounds kind of wonky, but is truly important in the administration. The language, the White House released a fact sheet this morning, and it says that the council will work to advance gender equality globally through diplomacy, development, trade, as Hannah mentioned, something truly important, and defense. And also by recognizing the needs and roles of women and girls in conflict prevention, peace building, democratic rights respecting governance, global health, and humanitarian crises and development assistance. So they're really capturing the gamut of issues that have long been a priority around the world as it relates to advancing gender equality. So, I mean, that said, I think the degree to which the council will be successful will depend on a few issues. Some of them Hannah's already raised, so I won't go into it too much, but just to say that, of course, it's relevant in the United States too, right? So setting measurable goals, so we can say this is what we're trying to achieve, and actually going back and measuring those goals year after year and measuring progress, setting budgetary targets. We can say that we're going to do all of these things, but if we don't assign money to them, then we're unlikely to make measurable progress. And in addition to that, I think really on the national security front, close collaboration and connection to the National Security Council will be key. And I think one of the traps that we fell into in the Obama administration is where gender issues were, even though we focused on trying to mainstream them across the foreign policy apparatus, at the same time, they were sort of siloed. And so we would think about, okay, the ambassador at large for global women's issues will engage on this, but is the ambassador to Iraq engaging on it? Is the ambassador to Guatemala engaging on it? And we tried to achieve that in the Obama administration, but I think, speaking honestly, we fell short. And certainly we made no progress over the last 4 years in the United States. And so I think for these efforts to be truly successful, we really need to be thinking about it as a national security priority, not a priority for the Gender Policy Council. And that means ensuring that gender considerations and gender analysis are integrated into all of our national security policy debates and discussions, but most especially those that resolve around conflict, right? So the body of research around why women's inclusion in peace building and security is important is vast. We don't need to go into that here, but we need to make sure then that gender considerations, that women's participation are truly included in those debates. So when we're talking about the migration crisis at our border, that we're including specific issues related to women and girls, but that also we're including women's voices in those discussions. And just finally, I think the other area that would really go a long way in enhancing this, and you mentioned at the beginning, I serve as the senior lecturer in intelligence studies. And I think so far in the United States, the intelligence community has been pretty much left out of these discussions, and that's problematic. Policymakers are hearing about risks around the world from the intelligence community, and if the intelligence community isn't presenting gender analysis, if the intelligence community isn't looking at gender-specific issues, then policymakers aren't going to be thinking about it either. So I think we really need to make sure that the intelligence community is included in our implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security Act in the United States, and that they're truly taking on these issues.
So Julia, taking a little bit of a step back from that and looking more broadly, one of the things that has been noted about the Biden administration is the most diverse cabinet in history. And also as one starts to look at who some of the key people are in the National Security Council, in the State Department, there are many women who are involved in shaping foreign policy and national security policy moving forward, many people of color as well. Hopefully, just by having participation of people who look different, the kind of thing that you're describing will start to take hold. But don't we need to do more than that? Can you talk a little bit about how integrating women's viewpoints and women's issues in foreign policy and national security can actually happen moving forward?
Sure. I mean, I think certainly including women at the table, and including not just women, but a diverse range of women. And you mentioned people of color. I mean, if we look at the data of women's participation in the US national security workforce, it's nowhere near parity, especially when you look at some agencies like DOD, the Department of Defense. But it's particularly bad when you look at the participation of women of color. I think the United States had, before the Biden administration, 1 or 2 Black women ambassadors. That is sort of a shocking statistic. And so we certainly need to do more to increase not just women's voices, not only women's voices, but a diverse range of women's voices at the table. But you're right, we can't only do that and then stop short. We also need to be thinking about gender issues and how we're integrating those at the table. So, I mean, taking a human security focused approach to looking at conflict prevention and conflict response around the world, right? And I think it will certainly be helpful to have more women involved in those discussions, but we can't assume that just because women are at the table that they're going to be discussing gender issues. And so we also need to make sure that people who are responsible for covering gender issues are included in those discussions. So is there a representative of the Gender Policy Council invited to National Security Council meetings where they're debating what do we do in Syria or Yemen? How do we bring those conflicts to a close? That's where I think we really need to ensure gender mainstreaming and gender integration.
Thank you, Julia. So we've also been joined by Dr. Armgard von Reden. She's the Chairwoman of Women in International Security in Germany. Thank you for being with us. I know that you missed the beginning when Hannah was talking a little bit about the EU's Gender Action Plan, but you caught most of what Julia was saying about the introduction of a new Gender Policy Council, which will be introduced today or signed into law through an executive order today by Joe Biden. And so I'd like to bring you into the discussion as well, Armgard, and ask about your views on how gender equity can be achieved when thinking about foreign policy and national security issues.
I'm sorry for being late. I realized that my clock was set at 4:30 for our discussion, so I'm happy that you pinged me. The thing is as follows. With regard to the EU Gender Equality Strategy 2020 to 2025, Hannah has already outlined it. What is, I think, even more important is GAP 3. GAP 3 is the Gender Action Plan number 3, which is specifically geared towards foreign policy. And I think that that is something where European Union is trying to, not only in its own, so to speak, EU realm, but worldwide, to push gender issues. What they're trying to do and to accomplish, and that I think is the most important thing, is not only will they allocate funds, but install a management system for it. And it will depend very much on how this management system will function, on whether it will be successful or not. And I think it would be a good idea to take a look at how other countries, how other states like the United States have done this in order to see what can we learn from each other and what has worked well in the area of national security and what has not worked well. And yes, maybe we can even learn from industry, because I, for example, was for 3 years the executive that was in charge of the German Women's Leadership Council. And so how to manage these processes is something where industry is actually quite good at.
So that is actually a perfect segue to a follow-up question that I wanted to ask you about. Of course, you spent much of your career in the private sector. And as a strategy consultant in Berlin, you work with a lot of companies on diversity issues as well. So what are some of those lessons that can be learned from the private sector and actually applied in the field of foreign policy?
Yeah, one of the things that the EU has laid out in its plan is that it wants to have an annual report about the progress. Annual reports are wonderful because all of a sudden comes November, they all realize they have to write an annual report, right? And then they start like hell. And funnily enough, they find something which has been accomplished, right? So it's amazing. But the problem is that you really have to make sure that the measurements you're measuring, and that is something that the EU is trying to focus on as well. We'll see whether they're successful. But when I was the executive sponsor for IBM's Women's Leadership Council, every month I got a progress report with the figures on how we did against the plan for the year. So, every quarter I could thinking of the old quarterly measurements of companies, I could turn to the colleagues where nothing had happened and ask them, where do you stand, and remind them that that is a process that has to be followed in every aspect. And so that nobody could say, oh, I forgot, right? Because we were on their back every quarter of the year. I mean, if they didn't match their plans, but if they were doing fine, we even sent them a letter or an email saying, you're doing great. So, and the same is true, for example, if you think of women representations in commissions, in peacekeeping organizations, etc. Yeah? I have a beautiful example which I would love to bring, which is the Swiss Minister of Defense. The Swiss Minister of Defense had a proposal list for a new commission she had to install. And there was no woman on that list. And so she said, where are the women on this list? And they said, there are none because we cannot find some. So she sent them back and said, look closer, take a closer look. So they again came back. And then she said, all right, then obviously we don't need this commission, so I will not install it and abandon it. And she said, it's interesting how quickly they found the women, and they're very good women. So I think this is the way you have to deal with obnoxious people who say nothing can be done.
Thank you. And I'd like to bring Hannah back in, because Hannah, we ended with you talking about concrete action that can actually be taken to bring women to the table. And we've heard a little bit from Armgard about lessons from the private sector, but I promised that we would come back to you to hear a little bit about your thinking about what steps can be taken moving forward to try to make sure that women's voices are heard.
Well, I mean, first of all, I was smiling quite a lot because I'm trying to be a bit like Armgard. I will not be as successful as Armgard because I'm not having a whole team behind me that does gender work only. But I just remember I had a quote this morning about the newest appointments in the European External Action Service, where basically the HRVP is a man, the SecGen is now a man, and all the deputy directors are now also men, with always the same execution. We didn't find women. And then I said, well, if you don't find women, maybe there's a problem with the job description. Maybe just revise the job description and do another round. Because if you hear the problem is, and that's slightly different in the private sector, and that's something I think we need to tackle, is these many years of time that you just need to amass sitting in a certain position. So you need to have like 15 years of supervision as a senior official to be allowed to move to the next step. But if 15 years ago there was no woman in the senior level, how do you expect 15 years later to be a woman in the senior level? And I really don't think in foreign policy that the key criteria of qualification is how many chairs you have been sitting in the last 15 years. So that's what I mean by we also just need to say, if you don't find a woman with this job description, maybe look at the job description again. It's like Armgard saying, if there is no female head for this committee, well, then we don't need the committee. So it's exactly the same approach. And that's something I'm trying to build on. But the other thing, Stephen, when you said, what can we do that women's voices are being heard? And that's something I stumbled over a bit when I listened to Julia. For me, having women at the table and taking a gender lens does not and should not be the same. I want women to sit at the table who give a fuck about gender lens, and I want to have men sit at the table who are looking for the gender lens. That's when we have reached it. Not if every woman that sits at the table automatically has to be the one with the gender lens. No, please not. They should be there in all their diversity, as all the men have to sit there in all their diversity. And then the question is, how do we get there? I mean, I made a few suggestions already with the mission letters, with the staff assessments, with the trainings, because I really think that's institutional, but that clearly says it's equally as important as other criteria that have been important for 100 years, and that you have trained to observe and that you have trained to basically follow. And that one is at least equally important. And then the question is institutionally, how do we get there? And I found one thing very interesting with the trainings, because I start meeting men in these foreign services, but also in the military, who understand why it is important to have that gender lens. Kind of, if you explain it to them with examples, like the one I just did with the trade, you could also do it on hardcore security issues. They understand it, but they do not yet see it. Like me, if I look at an event, I go through the list of panelists and I can tell you within a minute, okay, I'm not going, because I know it's manuals only. And there are people who do not see manuals only. There are people who see a picture and do not realize there's something wrong if it's just 20 guys with suit and tie. I have learned that. So we need to train them to learn it, to observe it, to see it, or to just see the moment when they think they should ask someone who knows this. And there we can build, I think that's something we have reached in the last 20 years. We can build a network of allies on exactly these issues if we give them the training, the capacities, well, and the recognition for doing that. And inside the institution, I think that for me would be the main point to reach. I even realize that with my male colleagues in the parliament sometimes. Some, they are lost cases because they just don't care and they just ridicule it, and that's fine. But those who want to do a proper job but lack the tools, we should really equip them with the tools.
Julia, I've been watching you nod your head as Hannah was speaking, and so I'd like to bring you into the conversation, particularly because the institute that you lead, the Johnson Institute for Responsible Leadership, is in the business of training the next generation of foreign policy and national security leaders. And so as you look at I would be interested in your comment both on what Hannah and Armgard were saying, but also as you look to the next generation, do you see a change in the mindset among the men and women who are attending the University of Pittsburgh and taking classes through your institute?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, I agree with everything that both Armgard and Hannah have said. I would add, maybe from the perspective of the United States, in addition to identifying women to put in these positions, we also have a lot of work to do, and this might be more uniquely American than European, at making the institutions themselves safe places for women to work, and not only safe, but also accommodating towards women, right? And so what we see in many of the national security agencies is even when we do get women in the door, we struggle to retain them. And so, I mean, the federal government only in October of 2020 approved paid parental leave for federal employees. That, I mean, our European colleagues are probably like, what are you talking about? That's astonishing, right? That federal employees did not have paid parental leave until 3 months ago. And so, I mean, things like paid parental leave and parental, not just maternal, right? So making both partners equal in caring for their children. We have a childcare crisis in the United States that the pandemic has really brought to the fore, but it wasn't just a crisis because of the pandemic, right? So affordable childcare does not exist. And often we see women leaving the workplace, and particularly in the national security workforce, where because of the classified nature of the work, you can't work from home. And so typical strategies that American families try to piece together to balance work and childcare don't work if you're in the foreign policy, if you're in the national security establishment. And then, I mean, certainly thinking about safety, we have a major crisis, particularly in our military, related to sexual assault. And until we resolve that, it's going to be impossible to increase the number of women, particularly serving in uniform. So, I mean, that's just sort of what I would add from the American perspective, in addition to everything that Hannah and Armgard said. Related to the next generation, I mean, I think certainly we are seeing progress, but we can't assume that it's there. And what I do see among my students, and recognizing that I'm not looking at a sample size that's representative of the US population, but I'm looking at a sample size of people who are attending graduate school wanting to pursue careers in foreign policy and national security. And among those students, I certainly see a receptivity to learn. And so I think many of them come in not knowing anything at all about the women, peace, and security agenda, not knowing anything at all about 1325, but they are receptive to learning about it and truly take these ideas on board. They also certainly have very different views on the importance of diversity and inclusion than, you know, I'm now, I guess, 2 generations older than my students. And so certainly they have very different views on that and just on the importance of diversity and inclusion than colleagues of my generation have, which I think is promising. But I don't think that we can assume that we'll see progress just as time goes on. We have to continue to work at it.
Let me remind our viewers that if you have questions for our speakers, you can use the Q&A function to pose your question, and we will fold in as many questions from our viewers as we can. We've talked a lot sort of about the challenges at home, if you will, in sort of the internal structures that we have, whether it's here in the United States or in the European Union. We haven't really talked about the German government, but I think many of the issues that both Hannah and Armgard raised are mirrored in government institutions. And we've sort of touched on some of the challenges globally. And certainly Hannah and Julia, you both commented on the challenges inherent with pushing gender equity worldwide. But I'd like to spend a few minutes widening the aperture a little bit and drawing on some of the international experiences that each of you have had. I was interested as I went through your bios again to see that each of you has had some experience dealing with countries in the Middle East, but also elsewhere. And so while it's clear that we have a lot of work to do at home, how likely is it that we will be able to achieve or see greater gender equality in other parts of the world as well? And what can US and European foreign policy do to facilitate that process? Armgard, would you like to sort of take a first crack at answering that question?
Yeah, I was responsible for Eastern European countries. And I lived in Brussels and in France and in Washington. So I was very much impressed by the Eastern European countries with regard to the facilities for childcare and the possibilities to, at the same time, raise a family and work. If you look, for example, at crucial professions of women in these countries in terms of engineering, etc., they're far advanced with comparison to Western German societies. So obviously one of the most important issues is the possibility, as Julia also mentioned, for the United States to combine the possibility to raise a family and have good childcare for the children. That's one thing. What we also see and let's just for a moment focus on Europe, is a backlash. I mean, Hungary was a country which is at the heart of Europe, is all of a sudden prohibiting to get a degree in gender studies. So we have to, so to speak, the Germans would say we have to take a close look at our own nose and to make sure that these things within the European Union are taken care of. An interesting thing is if you look at the military, needless to say, Germany, you know, for 20 years now has people in the German, women in the German military. So we have a lot to learn from other countries. Interestingly enough, it is something where you find that the Navy has the most women, which I found extraordinarily interesting. But when it comes to the top, needless to say, there are lots of biases against women. However, with women participating in, let's say, Afghanistan in the forces, the men realize what a value add these women have when it comes to dealing with the societies. So slowly but steadily, there is a common more understanding on yes, you need both sectors. It is interesting to do online discussions on these gender issues with the military, not only with the military, but also with organizations which are very male dominated. And the result is very often similar. The men think all the women's programs we have work wonderfully, and they're so absolutely magnificent, we don't need to do anything else. And the women think we have never worked in a male chauvinistic organization to begin with, and in 5 years we will be somewhere else. So there is a gap between what people at the top think and what those who are really affected by it think.
Thank you. Hannah.
Well, I would pick it up from Armgard's nose, but move more towards the Middle East, if that's fine. I'm the chair of the delegation to the Arabian Peninsula of the European Parliament. So Arabian Peninsula, that's all the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and so on, and Yemen. So this is like one of the regions where we are just stereotypically thinking that women are really left out of the public sphere and that women do not play a role at all. And of course, when I took over this chairwomanship of a predominantly male delegation, of course, of the European Parliament, working together with the Secretariat that is predominantly male, working together with the structure and the European External Action Service in Brussels, as well as in the field that is male only, I made the issue of women empowerment, of course, as a green and as a feminist, as one of the core areas. And this is something that I would just advise everyone to do. And it was for me one of the most empowering experiences. Use the little power you have and just try to see how far you can push the boundaries. And it's amazing how far you can be. It started with me saying, okay, we do women empowerment as a key topic. And all the ambassadors of the 7 countries who came to their first visit were super happy about it because they wanted to talk about it. I mean, okay, it needs to be said. It's not that every woman is free in all of these countries. It's mostly the women that do not have a main problem with the regime, but still women are increasingly playing a role in all of these countries. Then I said, okay, we're having to do a delegation visit to Saudi Arabia. And delegation visit means I can go, and then all the political parties can also send representatives to be part of my delegation. And already in the first letter I said, and we all said we want to talk about women empowerment, so please make sure that I'm at least traveling with a, gender balanced delegation. Well, what happened? All political groups came forward with guys. So just imagine the looks, me, then the European Parliament delegation with 12 guys going to Saudi Arabia and talk about women empowerment and gender equality. And I really have a problem, and that's what meant with the starting with the nose that Armgard mentioned. We need to set an example to credibly talk and influence this issue somewhere else. And at the moment, often we are not. And then it's really this notion about Europeans just thinking they are better than everything, but look at your numbers. And then, the whole discussion is gone. So in the end, I sent them back. I said, I'm only going with the gender balanced delegation or I'm going alone. And of course, they found women. Then we went there and I made an effort to go a day earlier and meet with the women of the Shura Council, which is our counterpart, which is like the parliament, because there are women. By the way, Saudi Arabia has a 25% women quota for its gender council, for its Shura Council, which some in Europe still challenge as impossible to do. And I met with the women first. And we discussed about these issues. What does it mean to be amongst the first women in this Shura Council? What does it mean to have your face shown on a newspaper, for example? What does that make with your family? How are your relations within the women, with your male counterparts? And we had this wonderful day of just female solidarity exchange. And when we had the formal meeting the next day, I knew the women already. So I kind of did what the guys always do. I knew these women already. And then they were confident to speak up. And if they were not, or we had an issue because the discussion was going slightly like in a direction we didn't want to have it, I just sent them a text. And then they kind of put their delegation back. And we had this very nice way of maneuvering all the guys because we had these ties. And then when we had the reception at the ambassador, I said, why don't we just invite female entrepreneurs? And when we had this discussion, the first funny thing was we had the discussion around evening time and they had ordered these beautiful cupcakes. I was like, oh my God, okay, he knew there were women coming, so he's going to order cupcakes. And then when we were all in the room, he said, well, I feel like I don't belong here. And then I said, well, now you know how I feel all the time, but you're very much welcome here. And in the end, they were super happy about having these kind of exchanges. And I mean, I didn't change the world doing that, but if you consistently just try to push these boundaries a bit, I mean, now they kind of know when they have to call me, for example, when things are happening in Saudi on women's issues.
So Hannah, it's a little bit like taking a lot of small steps can help really have an impact. But I think what you just described is also a testament to how important it is to have the personal connection with the people that one's engaging with and talking with to try to expand their horizons. Julia, how do you think the Biden administration will advance gender equality around the world?
I mean, I think it certainly will be a priority for them. I think what they will need to do is make sure, as I mentioned at the start, that it's fully integrated into the broader discussions about our foreign policy topics. And so, I mean, certainly the administration consists of thousands of people, and some of them will be focused on women's rights, on human rights globally, but we need to make sure that particularly at the top that they are. And that's where I think it remains to be seen what will happen. And, building on what Hannah said about the Middle East, I mean, certainly the region's been mired in conflict for 10 years now. And when we look at conflict prevention, what we saw during the Obama administration was that often the women's channel was sort of left to a separate civil society channel. I'm thinking specifically on Syria and the Syrian peace process, where the women's group would kind of like lobby for a meeting and then maybe get a meeting on the margins of a Geneva summit, but would never actually be at the table. And I think that's an area where the administration needs to demonstrate its commitment to these principles by saying, if women are not seated at the table, then there will not be a table. Just as Hannah said with her own delegation going to Saudi Arabia, if either you send a gender balanced delegation or we send no delegation at all. And I think we need to recognize what the research tells us about women's participation and what that means for the prospects of lasting peace, and then actually put that into action. And thinking specifically on Syria, but also on Yemen and on Libya, looking across the Middle East. And then certainly for the United States, I mean, a top priority is going to be disengagement from Afghanistan, and the same thing there. So how do we ensure that gains on women's rights are not lost? But not only that, but that we continue to see progress and that women continue to play a role in the governance of Afghanistan after the United States finally departs.
So let me fold in a viewer question that actually really picks up where you left off in terms of gains for women's rights that might have been lost. I think all of us probably saw the news yesterday that Switzerland passed a burqa ban. And one of our viewers writes, Switzerland passed a burqa ban because it was argued to be a concern of national security. Is this an infringement on the rights of Muslim women in Switzerland? Who would like to sort of take a crack at dealing with that question first?
I'm the politician, so I assume I have to. Huh? This is a really tricky issue because you can answer it from two sides, and I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. The one is that for many, the burqa, and actually it's the same with the headscarf, it's just on a different level, but it's the same kind of discussion, is seen by many as the oppression of Islamism. So a certain way of interpreting the Quran to force this on women. And I think if it's either the burqa or the headscarf as a way to force this on women, then I think it's highly problematic. And in some degree, for example, when we speak about public spaces, about teachers and so on, the state may have a say in that. But for many women, it's also a sign of their own decision-making and of their own independence if they want to wear that. And I had these exchanges with my colleagues in Saudi Arabia who say, I feel more comfortable, or it's part of my tradition, or I just feel I look more pretty or more elegant if I wear that. And then she says sometimes, because I made this joke, you know, if I have a bad hair day, I sometimes envy you because you can just put them under the scarf. And then she said, you know, I sometimes envy my female colleagues with the burqa because they can even eat during parliamentary sessions without someone seeing it. So that's also a way of just playfully looking at these things. And I really think we need to find ways to make sure that no woman is forced or feels forced to wear any of this. I'm just not sure laws will go there. I'm just afraid laws will just make sure to some degree that these women will then not be able to go out anymore, which is exactly the opposite, at least, of what the liberals wanting to ban that want to reach. Maybe the right wings who want to ban that want to reach exactly that, but then it's far away from being my agenda, to be frank.
Armgard, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the way they related it to national security was not only with the, let's say, I think it's an absolutely minimal number of women in Switzerland who wear a burqa. If it's 100, it would be exaggerating, right? So the way they framed it was, it's not only forbidden to cover your face with a burqa, but also to cover your face during demonstrations, etc. So what they want, pretending, is we want transparency, and it is our Swiss tradition to show our face. So that's how they framed it, right? What might be behind this, and I'm not, you know, I'm not an expert on Swiss thinking. I'm far from it, so to speak. Is that, needless to say, in the summer months, some of the cities in Switzerland, like Interlaken, for example, are swamped by people from the Middle East who escape the brutal hot summers in the Middle East and come to Interlaken and other Swiss towns. The same is for Austria. So therefore it is, how should I say, they design it as a package so that it does not come across as anti-Muslim, but, so to speak, this is our Swiss tradition. The consequences of this will be interesting to watch. I'm pretty sure that the Swiss will have a lot to explain internationally on how they want to implement this new decision by the people.
Well, this is certainly a story that is worth watching in the days and weeks ahead to see how the Swiss will explain this internationally. I had promised Hannah that we would stop on time, and so I have one final question I'd like to ask each of you, and I'd like to start with you, Julia. We've been talking about how important it is to bring more women to the table, but we've also said that just having women at the table is not enough. One of you actually said, you know, we need more men to look at issues through a gender lens. And so the closing question that I have is, how do we do that? How do we bring more men to the gender table? How do we get them to consider gender as they're considering these other national security and foreign policy issues?
I think, well, from my perspective and where I sit now, we start by teaching it at universities, ideally we start by teaching it in grade school, right, and build our way up. But I'll speak from my own perspective at a university. I think introducing them to these concepts, so it's not something that they're hearing when they're 35 years into a career, but it's something that they're hearing before they ever embark on their career, when they have time to explore the research, to really understand how these principles are grounded in research. I believe, at least from my perspective, that that's an important thing that we can do for those of us who sit at universities.
Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would take it from Julia, and I'm actually fascinated. I heard about this whole gender and feminism discussion, not even in my first studies, but later on when I studied political science in the certain round, in the second round. And my kids are apparently growing up, I mean, in a family where everything is upside down from the traditional way. My husband is at home doing homeschooling for a year now. I'm just flying around the world, and sometimes they follow my Instagram profile to kind of find out where I am, which leads to very funny discussions, by the way, by phone. And it's very interesting how just by having these like feminist or non-traditional thing as a normality around them, how they are becoming feminists. Like I was going shopping with my daughter 6 months ago. She's like, 13 now? And we walked through the mall and she said, but Mom, that's a sexist advert. It was basically a woman with the jeans and the guy staring at her butt, which I mean, you can all imagine. And I said, yes, you're right. And I never I never had the concept of sexist in my head when I was at that age. And for her, she has it in her head. She walked there. It's integrated into her life like something super, super normal, like everything else. And I think once we get there, and my son is the same, like when he sees women doing stuff on old movies, he says, does she do that voluntarily? You know, and and that's amazing. And that gives me so much hope, to be frank. And that now we just need to change the structures that they will not be frustrated when they enter there.
I think before Armgard jumps in, I mean, I think, you know, what both of you have said of starting in school is important, and for, you know, a teenager to be exposed to this, for children to be exposed to this is important. But I sort of feel like that's still waiting yet another generation or 2 generations for there to be real change. And this is not something, you know, we started our conversation talking about the UN passing a resolution 20 years ago that was groundbreaking at the time, and yet we're still working on many of the same issues. And so it seems to me that while there's hope in the future, we need more action now. But Armgard, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. I think one of the best methods I found is by realizing that people love success. So it's not only men, but women as well. So for example, if you look at the studies, that if in a peace process, women participate in this peace process, the chances that this peace process is successful and that the peace treaty lasts longer than 15 years is much bigger. The same is true for the for the industry sector. So the London School of Economics found out that if you have 3 or more women on a board, the return on investment for a company is 25% higher. So why should you, in your clear mind, you know, give away the chances for success by leaving out women? And we found that that is something that men listen to, this argument, right? So the other thing is, and that is which, so to speak, is helpful, that you fill the pipeline, yes, with good women, but also with good men, because it is amazing how many middle-class men are in high positions, I'm sorry to say. So coming back to the Swiss, they found a very good method. And it's, the word bad-mouthing. The Swiss found the method good-mouthing. So if you find somebody at a conference or work with somebody, you recommend them and put them on a list. And by the end of a year, if everybody, contributes, you have a pretty good qualified list of people who can take a position. And it's like Hannah said before, if you can't find a woman, change the description, or if you fill the pipeline correctly, you will find a woman. So it's a how should I say, it's a national security and economical success factor to have women on board.
Well, I just want to thank all 3 of you, Armgard, Hannah, and Julia, for what I've found to be a very interesting, informative, and even inspirational conversation. I would love to continue the conversation with each of you. but I know that everybody has other appointments that they need to get to. But I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and this has been a great outlook. I mean, obviously there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in this arena, but I think through discussions like this one and efforts that all of us are making to reach a larger audience and to make them more aware of the fact that one needs to look through a gender lens when dealing with many of the foreign policy and national security challenges that we will face in the years ahead. Only then will we be able to be successful. So thank you again to the three of you. This has been a very a fun talk, but also a really interesting talk for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a beautiful day.